The New Orleans Saints and New York Jets are expected to battle it out for head coach candidate Aaron Glenn. Let's break down why the New Orleans Saints might be his best fit. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, with Kliff Kingsbury now officially added to the interview request list, I want to discuss why he could potentially rank highly for New Orleans amongst their other potential hires. Meanwhile, offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak is drawing interest from other teams. Could that mean that the New Orleans Saints plan to go to an offensive head coach if they don't get their number one guy? And speaking of number one guys, we all know that that's Aaron Glenn. The New Orleans Saints and New York Jets expected to battle it out for Glenn. I want to dive into why the Saints might be the better fit for him as a first-time head coach. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode. Whether it's your first time or your next time, we thank you very much for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at PrizePicks. Download the PrizePicks app and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. So, the New Orleans Saints have concluded their interview with Detroit Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn as their next potential head coach, right, for their head coach position. And I think the Saints and the Jets, who are kind of the two that are expected to kind of battle it out for Aaron Glenn, I think that the Saints are the better fit for him. And I want to discuss why, because I think it has to do with a lot of the reasons why many people don't think that the Saints are a good fit for any head coach. But it's because of those things that the patience that the New Orleans Saints are required to have with their next head coach might actually be a big-time draw. The Saints right now are $50 million over the salary cap. They don't have a long-term answer at quarterback currently, right? And when I say long-term answer, just to redefine that, quarterback on a rookie contract with at least one season's worth of starting experience. The Saints don't have that. They have Spencer Rattler, who could be the future at quarterback, but he's only got 6 games of starting experience so far, so he doesn't have the season. And he is on that rookie contract, which is helpful. Derek Carr is over the age of 30, over the age of 32. That puts him in a situation to where he's staring down the twilight of his career. Every quarterback would love to play until they're 40 years old, like Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady, but that's just not always going to be the case for every veteran quarterback out there. And so the Saints don't have that answer. So now both of those things might make you think like, oh, that's those are both good reasons to not take the job. But really, to me, what that does is that it guarantees patience for any particularly first-time head coach. Aaron Glenn's been a long-time defensive coordinator in the NFL. He is widely respected. He certainly is widely respected within the New Orleans Saints organization, having been with the organization before as their defensive backs coach until he left with Dan Campbell to go over to Detroit. And has done some great things with that defense, despite the fact that that defense has been so injured, which the Saints weren't able to do with a healthy defense and weren't able to do with an injured offense. And so I think when you look at the $50 million over the salary cap going into 2025, when you look at the no long-term answer at quarterback, what that tells you as a incoming head coach, especially as a first-time head coach, who's hoping for patience, who's hoping for, hoping for the opportunity to be able to prove things over time, right? Who's looking for a long-term engagement, not a short-term situation. Those two things beg patience from the New Orleans Saints, because you're bringing me in, let's say, as a full-time head coach, and you're giving me and you're saddling me up with this situation where I don't have a lot of money to go and spend in free agency. I've got some good draft capital, which is nice, but I don't have a lot of money to spend in free agency. And the biggest question mark on the team, or the most important position on the team, is a question mark at quarterback. And so for me, I look at that as being something that says, okay, probably not going to be able to do much in 2025, But that guarantees me basically a free year as a first-time head coach, or even as a head coach, period, right? When you're joining a new thing. I mean, think about Gerard Mayo with the New England Patriots, right? All he wanted was patience, and the New England Patriots had no patience for him. I think they got a little bit excited about the potential of Mike Vrabel. We'll see if he ends up joining the New England Patriots. That's certainly the expectation as of right now. But for New Orleans, like there's nobody else that's kind of the apple of the eye. It's Aaron Glenn. And so I think that the familiarity is something that's going to have kind of like cause people to turn their noses up at it. But the familiarity for Aaron Glenn means patience. The $50 million over the salary cap as of right now means there's not a lot I can do. So I got a free year here to establish the culture and then build on that culture starting in 2026. And then, of course, being able to go out and handpick your own quarterback in what's going to be a quarterback-friendly draft in 2026, I think that's a pretty good situation for an Aaron Glenn. Meanwhile, you look over with the New York Jets, you're dealing with Woody Johnson. That's not a great situation. You're dealing with Aaron Rodgers, or there's some kind of situation that will happen with Aaron Rodgers. Now, there is a very talented young defense over in New York. I think that could be the thing that's going to end up being very enticing for Aaron Glenn. They've got good talent on defense. Their defense is built a little bit more similarly to the Detroit Lions defense. The Saints pass rushers are a bit more kind of like focused on size and power, where you're looking at athleticism and speed with those other two teams. I think you've got the top corner right there in terms of Sauce Gardner, and so you love having that guy. But we've already seen players for the New York Jets say, hey, I'm looking forward to free agency. I'm up out of here and everything. So the culture rebuild there is going to be much tougher than the culture rebuild here. There, you're asking people to buy in. Here, people are already bought in. Players are already bought in, all of that. They just need to start winning games. They just want to start winning games. The last thing I'll mention too, as another thing that begs a little bit of patience, is the veteran roster. The Saints have 6 players that are taking up over $100 million of dead cap and salary cap and all this other stuff, and they're all over the age of 30. That's got to be something that changes here as they continue to move ahead. And we're talking about guys like Demario Davis and Cam Jordan and Tyrann Mathieu and Derek Carr and Taysom Hill. Like, you want to see this team get younger. It's going to take some time for them to start getting younger. So again, patience, right? You're effectively getting a free year here in New Orleans to focus on one thing and then start the official rebuild, whether that's incremental, however it is that you want to look at it. So I could see why the Saints are very interested in Aaron Glenn, right? I mean, they haven't scheduled any other interviews. They've requested other interviews, but the only interview they have left that's actually scheduled is Darren Rizzi sometime next week. We'll see what, when other interviews get scheduled and things like that. But the Saints have made it pretty clear that Aaron Glenn's their guy. They're not saying it out loud, but it's pretty clear just from looking at what their interview list looks like and all of that. I mean, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is the Saints only have 2 defensive coaches on their interview list so far. It's Anthony Weaver, the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator, and then Aaron Glenn, the Detroit Lions defensive coordinator. The rest of the guys are all offensive head coach candidates. So coming up next, I want to discuss why Klint Kubiak getting interest elsewhere could signal that the Saints will go to an offensive head coach if they can't get their top guy. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of all the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past thanks to our friends at TurboTax. You see, taxes shouldn't be as complicated and stressful as they've been made out to be. So that's why TurboTax is here to help change the game. They get started on your return right away. That means no more waiting for answers, no more wondering if you've been missing out on deductions. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts give you and your taxes their undivided attention. So if you're ready for stress-free taxes that that will get you the most money back guaranteed, then you can head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off the plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Full Service. Real-time updates only available as well over in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends over at PrizePicks, your one-stop shop for the best possible daily fantasy experience. I absolutely love PrizePicks because it's not you versus a bunch of mystery lineups, and it's also not your typical redraft league where you're having to deal with injuries and bad trade offers and all those other things. It's you versus the house. All that you have to do is pick 2 to 6 players and choose whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their stat projection. If they do so and you get those right, then you could win up to 1,000 times your money back. It's awesome. Over 10 million members and billions in winnings over at PrizePicks. Say it's clear why people are loving this platform. So all you got to do is head over to the PrizePicks app. You can download it and then use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. Get you $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup with the PrizePicks app. And of course, using that promo code LOCKEDONNFL, that's PrizePicks, run your game. All right, family. New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak is drawing interest from other teams. And I think that could be an indication that if the New Orleans Saints end up not getting their top dog in Aaron Glenn, that they may be looking at going for an offensive head coach. A very interesting situation for New Orleans. Now, here's what I want to say. The situation here so far is that 2 teams, the Cleveland Browns as well as the Seattle Seahawks, have requested to interview Klint Kubiak. That's not the same as him actually going to interview. We don't know yet if that request was granted. We don't know if that request was denied. That would be a general manager Mickey Loomis situation. Our understanding is that basically coaches were told, hey, look, you're employed until there's a new head coach and everything like that. And so if there's any potential interviews or anything like that, just make sure that basically that he knows he can handle on a case-by-case basis. I think that's what Darren Rizzi was referring to when he said that Mickey Loomis was going to handle lateral moves, i.e. offensive coordinator with the Saints to offensive coordinator with the Browns, right? Not an elevation or anything like that, on a case-by-case basis in his end-of-year press conference. And so we don't know yet if Klint Kubiak is actually going to be interviewing anywhere else, but the fact that this is floating around certainly does give an indication that the New Orleans Saints could end up seeing Klint Kubiak be a one and done. And if as we've discussed a bunch here on the show, him being a one and done isn't necessarily reflective of his talent as a play caller or the job that he did or anything like that. It would mostly instead come down to the fact that he would be just kind of on the wrong side of this situation if the Saints were to hire an offensive play caller as their head coach, right? You hire a Joe Brady or a Kliff Kingsbury or a Kellen Moore, which I'm not sure that Kellen Moore really inspires that much confidence, but you hire one of those 3 guys that's an offensive play caller. And I guess Mike Kafka's in there too, but he didn't call plays in 2024. I don't know if the Saints would like him better as like a CEO head coach where you're just you're the head coach and you have 2 coordinators that are doing their thing. So maybe he doesn't necessarily qualify in this conversation. But considering the fact that the Saints have, 8 guys on their list and 2 of them are defensive play callers, and I guess Vrabel could be a defensive play caller as well. It kind of puts you in a situation here to where you go, man, I could see the Saints potentially going with one of those offensive play callers and then moving on from Klint Kubiak, giving him the opportunity to go somewhere else. It's been well documented over the course of this offseason already that Kevin Stefanski and the Cleveland Browns are very interested in bringing in the Kubiak system. And that goes to the Gary Kubiak system, which is also the Shanahan system, and also what Klint Kubiak did here in New Orleans. I think it's easy to sit back and say, that the Saints weren't as successful on offense as you wanted them to be and stuff like that. I certainly would say that. They barely really improved from where they ended up last year with Pete Carmichael. But I think a lot of NFL teams would give the grace of injury and all those other things, that the playbook became limited, not able to do a lot of the things they would typically like to do, didn't have their starting quarterback for 6 games, or 7 games rather, all that stuff. I think that that's something that other NFL teams give Klint Kubiak, a guy like Klint Kubiak, the kind of benefit of the doubt, especially when you saw the potential of what the offense could be in the first 2 games, which also complemented the defense, right? When you're in a situation over on the offensive sides where you're scoring points seemingly at will. Remember, this team went 15 consecutive scoring drives with their first team offense on the field over the course of those first 2 weeks, it benefits your defense because you're dictating the terms of the game, right? You're forcing the opposing team to go to the air. You're making them one-dimensional, all that other stuff. And so if you're able to get a guy like Klint Kubiak in a situation that could be beneficial for him, where he could have healthy starters the entire way through, and it doesn't work out here in New Orleans because the Saints go with an offensive head coach, then these requests become interviews out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, Klint Kubiak ends up being a one and done. Now, it's interesting because it's like, okay, well, the Saints went out there and they got this offensive coordinator that they were super happy about, that they claimed was their, number one guy, which is interesting because we also have heard the reports that the team would have given John Gruden that offensive coordinator position. So which one is it, right? Was John Gruden really the number one option? And then they went for Klint Kubiak, or was Klint Kubiak really their guy the entire time? And that report that the Saints would have gone with John Gruden otherwise would be inaccurate in that case. But I don't know. I mean, considering some of the things that we've seen from this franchise over the course of the last little bit, yeah, I mean, it could very well be that they actually really wanted John Gruden, but then they went into Klint Kubiak when they couldn't get John Gruden to take the gig. So for New Orleans, I think that that's the reason why you say, okay, interested in what you're doing as an offensive potential head coach. So come through an interview. And I think too, that even when Klint Kubiak had his entire offense and all those other things, that there was still a predictability issue with the offense, right? You knew what was going to happen when Adam Prentice was on the field. You knew what was going to happen when, especially early on in the season, Foster Moreau was a massive tell. They were running the football like 70-something% when he was on the field. Then that ended up changing as the wide receivers got hurt and all these other things. And then they had to transition and transition their passing game to run majority through their tight ends and stuff like that. Then you saw kind of the breakout year from Foster Moreau. So, there was still some of those things. And then, issues with the offensive line and all this other stuff. And then, of course, the issues got compounded by injury because the drop off between the starters and the depth was so drastic and everything. So I think that that's really important too, is that maybe there's things that the Saints saw in this offense that they didn't really like. And so because of that, they're willing to look at these offensive head coaches. They're willing to look at Joe Brady, who gets a lot of kind of, how do I want to say this? The bets on Joe Brady end up getting hedged in terms of his effectiveness because of the fact that he's got Josh Allen. But look at the rest of the team around Josh Allen. They don't have the top flight wide receiver names. They turned James Cook, who was really talented in the first place, into a top running back in the NFL. And the fact that Ken Dorsey couldn't do that, a veteran offensive play caller, a veteran offensive coordinator, and then Joe Brady took over as the interim and found immediate success with that team, I think that goes to show you that there's something of desire there. Kliff Kingsbury might not be the best fit for what the Saints currently do, but if the Saints are simply interested in what it is that Kliff Kingsbury does, then that might mean something in terms of what they could potentially get going over on the offensive side. Although I do think that would require a change at quarterback for New Orleans. I don't think Kliff Kingsbury is going to find much success with a quarterback the style of Derek Carr. But could Joe Brady? Could Kellen Moore? Klint, to be fair, Klint Kubiak found success with Derek Carr. And so I think maybe this might signal, if they start to allow him to take some of those interviews, it could signal a lean towards an offensive head coach. If the team doesn't land Aaron Glenn, let's say Aaron Glenn chooses the Jets, then all of a sudden you see these coordinators, right? You see Kubiak end up taking these interviews, and then permission be granted for him to take those interviews, then yeah, I could see an offensive play caller on the way for New Orleans. Coming up next, we mentioned offensive play callers. We mentioned Kliff Kingsbury. Now that he's added to the interview list for the New Orleans Saints, I want to update our rankings for the potential hires. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. For all of the great things you can find over at FanDuel, they make it easier to make the most out of those big upsets in game-winning NFL playoff drives. Simply put, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. And right now, new customers can put $5 down and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose, no matter what. Just put down $5, you walk away with $200 in bonus bets. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything that you need, from live bets, same game parlays, and so much more, including spreads. Right now, you've got some big time underdogs in this matchup that might be able to cover the Pittsburgh Steelers taking on a division rival in the Baltimore Ravens. 9.5-point underdogs, definitely one that you could get in on. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season even more unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation, with Kliff Kingsbury now added to the list of requested interview candidates for New Orleans Saints head coaching position. I wanted to update our power rankings because I think he would rank pretty highly in terms of what the New Orleans Saints are looking for. So look, the last time that we did these power rankings, I kind of did my rankings of like what I see. Now I'm kind of looking at who's most realistic, what makes the most sense in terms of what the team wants, all these other things. So this is going to be slightly different than our last power rankings, but then updating as we go through. And we'll continue to update this as more and more candidates do get added to this list, because with only 8 candidates so far, I do expect that the Saints will continue to add candidates as they go through, but we'll see. I've been told that this is supposed to be an expansive coaching search, but so far that hasn't necessarily proven to be the truth, although the Saints coaching search, I believe, has been a little bit more expansive than like the New England Patriots, for instance. And that's one of the reasons why Mike Vrabel is no longer number 1, because it feels like Mike Vrabel and the New England Patriots are just kind of set. You know what I mean? So, but we'll see. Anything can happen. So number 1 for me when it comes to New Orleans Saints head coach power rankings, if you will, is Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions. We spoke about him in depth about how this could be a good situation for him here in New Orleans. But I also think that he's a good fit for what it is that New Orleans is looking for. I know a lot of people compare him to Dennis Allen, but his approach to coaching is very, very different than Dennis Allen's. And as a former NFL player, I think he'd be willing to put more in the hands of the players to go out there and do things. That's certainly what he's done over in Detroit. Now, his system can be a little complicated. He's had to simplify it a bit in Detroit. Might have to do the same thing here in New Orleans, but he'd have an off season to do that as opposed to making those adjustments partway through the season because of all of the injuries and things like that. So I put Aaron Glenn still up at the top in terms of who the New Orleans Saints want and who could still be a very, very good fit. Next thing that I want to look at here is Joe Brady. Joe Brady is number 2 for me on this list. Again, still a little bit of the connectivity, the familiarity there. But I also think that if the Saints do decide that, or if the Saints can't land Aaron Glenn, then Joe Brady becomes the next top guy in terms of who it is that they would be looking for as their likely hire. Brady is somebody that I think comes in and would take over play calling. So you could see Klint Kubiak end up heading out somewhere else. And again, I think Brady did a fantastic job with the Buffalo Bills when previous coordinator Ken Dorsey couldn't. So yeah, you could say that, oh, well, he's got Josh Allen and all this other stuff, but man, a big part of where he was successful, other coaches were not successful. So I think that gives him a real opportunity here. Number 3, that's where I've got Kliff Kingsbury. I really think that he is somebody that could rank highly for New Orleans if they decide that change is what they want, because then you'd be able to bring in a defensive coordinator that changes things over on the defensive side. And Kliff Kingsbury would change a ton on the offensive side and try to bring you into, further into the modernity of the NFL. With Kingsbury, you'd probably end up seeing a quarterback change, if not this year, in the coming years. And you'd see a defense that would have to practice up against a very, very kind of modern offense. And so that defense would then get the opportunity to kind of update itself as well. I think the Saints need more speed on defense personally. And they need speed and athleticism. And so I think that if you're practicing against a Kliff Kingsbury offense with a dynamic quarterback, that's going to help to make your defense better. And if that offense can cook and can go out there and get things done, then it makes the jobs easier for that defense as well, because opposing offenses become one-dimensional, get away from some of the other things that they might do to kind of mix and match things up. And that can certainly make life a little bit easier for an NFL defense as well. Number 4, I've got Saints interim head coach Darren Rizzi. I think that hiring Darren Rizzi would have to come with big changes elsewhere, right? On the defensive staff in terms of defensive coordinator and potentially other staff members beyond that. I think if you change defensive staff or defensive coordinator, you probably get an opportunity for Michael Hodges to go and interview somewhere else, and then you get an opportunity to bring in a new linebackers coach. I think the Saints still already technically have an open position for defensive line coach. I don't think anything's promised to Brian Young in that situation. Defensive backs wise, in terms of Marcus Robertson, we'll see where things go with him, but I could see him being a guy that does end up sticking around, or maybe even somebody that gets a nod as a defensive coordinator or gets an interview at least as a defensive coordinator. So I could certainly see the Saints sticking with Darren Rizzi if some of their other top options fall off. And I don't think there's that many top options ahead of Darren Rizzi, if I'm being honest. I don't think you have to get super far down the list to get to Rizzi, who's set to interview with the team next week. But I do think that when we look at where Darren Rizzi, if he were hired, the only way to really generate the buy-in of the fan base is going to be major change elsewhere. You can't come in and try to sell the same thing with Darren Rizzi, with Joe Woods, with Klint Kubiak, and with the same roster all over again in 2025. You'd have to accompany Darren Rizzi with a ton of change elsewhere. Number 5, I'll go with defensive coordinator of the Miami Dolphins, Anthony Weaver. I think that he's just somebody that brings one of the big qualities that New Orleans is going to want, and that's accountability. Former player, has worked with a lot of hard-nosed coaches that have a lot of hard-nosed approaches. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but I'm glad that it did. And I think that he's somebody that could potentially certainly brings that new defensive perspective that we were just talking about. You know what I mean? Like that idea of bringing in somebody that allows your defense to be able to compete with modern day offenses. I think he was a little limited in terms of the personnel over in Miami. He'd be able to have the opportunity to rebuild this defense over the course of the next couple of years with New Orleans. Up next at number 6, that's where I've got former Tennessee Titans head coach Mike Vrabel. I think Mike Vrabel is high on the list in terms of my personal interest, but in terms of the reality of the situation, that's what ends up knocking him down to number 6 in terms of these power rankings, is that it just feels like right now him to the New England Patriots is definitely going to be the best way, is definitely going to be the way that this all goes. We'll see. Like I said, we don't really know anything yet, but it just feels like with the limited amount of searching that the New England Patriots have done, I started to laugh there because it reminded me, though, that Aaron Glenn actually denied permission. Like he didn't want to meet with the New England Patriots. So that one was really interesting. But the Patriots just kind of like check their boxes early. And then it feels like they're just going to approach Mike Vrabel and really try to, bring him in to be their guy. So I have him low, but not the lowest, because I think he'd still be a good fit for New Orleans in terms of a culture builder, represents change, represents accountability, all those things, but just feels unrealistic. Number 7, I've got Philadelphia Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. He's an interesting option, but hard to believe that he's somebody that really fits. He's just not somebody that feels like he fits the culture of New Orleans. He's not somebody that feels like he fits the culture of this team. And I don't know that he's somebody that's going to bring a strong culture. He feels very just kind of, yes man-y. And maybe that's rude to say, I don't know, but that's the impression that I get from him. I think you want somebody, after having Dennis Allen for so long, I think you want somebody in the building that's going to push back. I think you want somebody in the building that's going to, challenge their roster, challenge their guys. And seeing Kellen Moore come in and be the guy that would be the head coach and also offensive play caller, he would end up being a guy that would be completely removed from the defense and just would not have that connection with the defense. And I don't know that he would go the extra mile to have that connection with the defense. So he concerns me a little bit as a potential head coaching candidate. And then finally at number 8, New York Giants offensive coordinator and assistant head coach Mike Kafka. He's an Andy Reid disciple, so people love that about him, but he's also been in and out of head coach conversation, has never really landed there. I think that's a bit of a red flag. Is it the interviews? Is it the way that he would manage things? He got play calling responsibility stripped from him in his final last year with the New York Giants. Just not a very good resume for Mike Kafka, despite having the Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes connection. So that's kind of the way that I look at it right now amongst these 8 candidates. Let me know what you think as well. Should somebody be higher? Should somebody be lower? Let me know. And real quick, I want to give a shout out to JT Gray selected to the second team all-pro list for special teams. Should have been a first teamer, so he still got robbed, but at least he's on that all-pro list nonetheless. All right, y'all. I'm going to see you on Monday. I'm going to take the weekend here to rest and recover and everything, and just get a little bit of rest and relaxation. So unless there's big breaking news, big breaking news, then I'll be here for sure. But on Monday, we'll dive into Mock Draft Monday, and then we should be hearing from General Manager Mickey Loomis soon as well. That might be something that happens early next week, so we'll continue to keep you up to date with that as well. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family is doing, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.